I had every intention of fixing a cultural map of the Ozarks.
You were gonna like put it on paper and this is what it is.
This is what this guy says is the Ozarks. The cultural Ozarks would be where Ozarkers live, but figuring out where that is, that's the tricky part.
Let's just start with your background. I think something that's interesting to me, I know you've published a lot, you've done a lot of podcasts, but I don't think I've ever actually heard your story. And you know, I know you've been doing Ozarks history and have kind of, you know, dove into this topic and have spent a good part of 30 years or more just dedicated to the Ozarks and the history. And so just tell me a little bit about where you're from and kind of how you got into your career and how that's all developed since then.
Sure. Well, I grew up in Izard County, Arkansas, which is in the north central part of the state, on a little farm. I grew up just a quarter mile up the road from my grandparents, and my dad had grown up on the same place. And by the time I came along, they had gotten out of the dairy farming and cotton raising business. It's about as far north as anybody was raising cotton back still in the 60s. And we just had beef cattle, and that's what we did. But I really didn't, you know, I don't think I'd ever thought about being in the Ozarks or thought about where the Ozarks was or were, you know, whether it's plural or singular, whatever it is, until I got to college. And when I was in my third year of college at what now is Lyon College in Batesville, Arkansas. It was still called Arkansas College back in those days. And this was the very early 90s. And I was in my third year of college, and I remember I was in a class on the civil rights movement. And so it's not something you would necessarily expect to get to the Ozarks through.
Sure.
But I had decided to do a research paper on the last Black community in the county where I grew up, and it was just a few miles from the little community where I grew up. There was a small Black community of, you know, at its height, maybe 100 people or so lived there. And as I got to doing the research and background and all that kind of stuff, I remember I was sitting in the little library there at Lyon College one day, and I pulled this book off the shelf, and it was called The Ozarks Land and Life by Milton Rafferty. And Rafferty was a longtime cultural geographer at what now is Missouri State University, which is where I work. At that time, it was Southwest Missouri State University. And I got to looking through this book, and there's Dr. Rafferty's map of the Ozarks, and sure enough, Izard County's right there in it. I thought, well, that looks like somebody would have told me that we were in the Ozarks. And but I think part of the reason I wasn't aware of it, I mean, we knew we were from the hills. We knew we were hill people, and that we contrasted ourselves with the people from the bottoms, which is what we call the flat country in northeastern Arkansas, the Delta. Mm-hmm. So we knew there was a little bit of a cultural divide and certainly a geographic divide there. But when I was growing up, we got our TV out of Springfield, Missouri, and they were always talking about the Ozarks this and the Ozarks that, and everything was Ozark in Springfield. Mm-hmm. They've been the queen city of the Ozarks since the late 1800s, and they were still, you know, really milking that back when I was a kid in the 70s and 80s, and so I knew the Ozarks was around Springfield, and right across the river from us was Stone County, Arkansas, which is where the Ozark Folk Center is in Mountain View. So I knew that was the Ozarks over there because everything was Ozark in Stone County because they were playing that up. So all these places that, you know, tried to capitalize on the Ozarks for tourism purposes I knew they were in the Ozarks. I just didn't know really what it was and what all it encompassed. And so I think at that moment I realized, hey, I'm from an actual identifiable region.
Yeah.
And this professor somewhere in Missouri has written a big old book about this region. And so from that moment forward, I was really interested to read anything I could about the Ozarks, to find out what I could. And what I realized was that even as an undergraduate student, certainly when I got to grad school, I realized there really hadn't been much what we would call scholarly history written about the Ozarks. There'd been a ton of stuff written about the Ozarks, but mostly it was by folklorists. Vance Randolph could fill this room himself with all the stuff he'd written about it, and by travel writers and people like that who weren't necessarily doing what I felt I wanted to do, which was tell a true story about the Ozarks, give the truest depiction of the region's history that I could give, and so that's really where my interest in the Ozarks started.
Yeah. Did you know? So in school, when you were going to school and you went to get your master's, did you know that one, you wanted to be a teacher, a history teacher, and then at that point you were kind of like, you found your niche and you're like, okay, I think that's what I'm going to focus on. Is that kind of how it worked?
Yeah, it is. There were really two things that I liked from the time I started college, or even before that. One was writing. I always liked to write, and I loved history. And so I think when I went off to graduate school at Auburn, and you're certainly not going to encounter a lot of Ozarks history.
No, you're not.
At Auburn University, which if you're like me, anybody who's listening, it's not the same now, but I didn't even know where Auburn was. I didn't know what state Auburn was in when I decided to apply. I thought it was in Georgia.
Oh, really?
But I grew up in the old Southwest Conference days when the University of Arkansas was in there with all those Texas schools, and we didn't play the SEC. So if it didn't have a state name in it, I didn't really know where it was. And for some reason, all I knew about Auburn was that's where Bo Jackson played football, and Charles Barkley played basketball, and I thought it was in Georgia. But either way, if it Georgia or Alabama, which is actually where it is, they don't really give a hoot about the Ozarks down there, and nobody's going to be talking about it. But that was the only place that offered me a graduate assistantship, so I just went where I could afford to go. I had to have some sort of financial help to go to school. But when I went, I knew that that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to eventually write a master's thesis on the history of the Ozarks, something. At that time, I didn't know enough to know what I couldn't do or what was reasonable for somebody to do. And then when I decided to just keep going because I didn't know anything else to do, I'm not exactly full of skills for the workforce. I just kept going, and I wrote my dissertation on the Ozarks too. And as a senior at Lyon College, I had written my senior paper on something to do with Ozarks history, and there were probably sentences from that paper that then made it into my master's thesis, that then made it into my doctoral dissertation, that then are in Hill Folks, which is the first book I published about the Ozarks, which came out in 2002.
Okay.
And so that was my revised dissertation. But yeah, that's right. I as unreasonable and as kind of unpractical as it sounds, I didn't go to graduate school thinking that I was going to get a job out of this. I just went to graduate school thinking this is what I want to do. Is I want to study and I want to write about the Ozarks. And it's a very selfish thing because I'm basically writing about my own personal history and the history of my family and my place, but I think most writers, whether you write fiction or nonfiction, in some way you're writing about you're exploring your own story.
Yeah.
In some, it may not be as direct.
It's your interest,
what I've done.
though,
Right. Yeah.
what you care about. Otherwise, you wouldn't be likely writing about it.
Sure.
Or studying it.
That's right. So it's been kind of a selfish thing for me to do all these years, but I've really enjoyed doing this, and it's been over 30 years I've been doing this now.
So did you come straight out of school and landed a job with Missouri State teaching Ozark history, or how did it start? Because I mean, you basically had to create your own curriculum on the Ozarks, because it's like you said, a whole lot didn't exist, or at least wasn't consolidated in a easy format to teach. I'm sure. Oh, right. They,
As you would expect, as a student, I'd never had a class on the history of the Ozarks. I did have an Arkansas history class, which was pretty unusual for back then. This was in the late 80s when I took that in college. And so I was really interested in that. But yeah, I've never had an Ozarks history class in my life. And probably the only place where that existed was at what now is Missouri State. SMS is what it was, Southwest Missouri State, when I was growing up, and up until about 20 years ago or so. And they were kind of the pioneers in the scholarly history of the Ozarks. They had historians, they had geographers, and other people there who were interested in the Ozarks, and started offering classes in that back in the 70s and things like that. But no, I spent a lot of time in a variety of jobs before I landed at Missouri State. I taught for a year at a branch of Mississippi State, and same colors, same initials.
Yeah.
So that
didn't have to change your wardrobe.
That's pretty handy. And I taught at a community college for a year. I went back to my alma mater at Lyon College, and I taught there for a few years. And that was actually the first place where I designed and taught a course on the Ozarks, was when I was at Lyon College. And that was just a little over 20 years ago that I did that. And then in 2008 is when I started at Missouri State. And it just so happened that they had decided that it would be a good idea to hire somebody for an endowed professorship to teach classes on the Ozarks. Mm-hmm. They had, all their Ozarks people had retired by then. And you know, I was lucky enough to
fresh blood.
There I was. You know, they didn't have a whole lot to pick from. I'll admit that. And I was there, and they hired me right before the recession hit. Had it hit a few months earlier, they probably would have just canceled that position and said, you know, we got to save the money.
So you skated in.
So I got in just under the wire. I mean, you know, right after they hired me, the bottom fell out of the economy, and I didn't get a raise for years after I started up there, but at least I had a job.
Yeah, you were working,
and I was, getting to talk about the Ozarks, so that was kind of fun, and so I've carried on a tradition that was started basically 50 years ago by my predecessors at Missouri State, and it's been nice to be able to do that.
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't feel like it's a job. You know, it's just something fun I get to do. Yeah.
To turn your
best
passion.
Kind of job.
I was gonna say, to turn your passion into your profession.
Yeah.
Is something not very many people get to do in their lifetime.
Right.
So that's pretty special.
Yeah.
2008, you're putting together your Ozarks history class. You really kind of have to start with defining what that is, defining the Ozarks. And as I've learned from reading some of your books and watching some of your YouTube videos of your classes, it's not a straightforward thing to define the Ozarks. It's not as simple as drawing a big circle around this area. There's a lot of different stuff that goes into it that you could consider. And so for you, where do you start with when we talk about the Ozarks, and even us, like help kind of guide us as the Ozark podcast, what falls into the Ozarks and what do you have to consider to put a circle around that place?
Yeah. After 30 years, you'd think I would have this figured out. and I'm more confused now than I was when I started. I mean, there's when you're talking about regional identity, it's a really slippery thing, and it's what'd you call it, the snot otter earlier?
Yeah.
I mean, it's like trying to get a hold of one of those things and keep it in one hand. First of all, you've got your physical Ozarks, and that's a little easier to define. That's the Ozarks that Milt Rafferty had his map for in that Ozarks Land and Life, and that's
this like where the mountains stop.
Right. That's it's the Ozarks based on geology.
Okay.
And that soils and terrain and all that kind of stuff and rocks and that's not all geographers and geologists agree on where that Ozarks is and isn't.
So even that is up for debate.
Well, that's
somewhat.
Somewhat because what you can see is if you go back to, say, you go back 100 years ago, or at least to the very late 1800s, what people were calling the Ozarks is what we would call the Ozarks and the Ouachitas today. That geographers call that the interior highlands because geologically the two regions are distinct from one another. But for years and years, we just sort of lumped. There are hills in the middle of middle of North America. Culturally, very little difference between them, so we'll just call this the Ozarks. It's easier to pronounce and spell than Ouachitas, so we're just going to stick with Ozarks. And so if you go back and you read a lot of the stuff that Vance Randolph wrote in the 20s and 30s and 40s, that Otto Ernest Rayburn was writing in the same era, they just hop back and forth across the Arkansas River. They're taking examples from the Ouachitas, from the Ozarks. They're in Mena, sometimes in Mount Ida, then they're in northern Arkansas, and it's all the same thing to them. And it really was for geographers until about 100 years ago or so, and that's when they started deciding, okay, there's enough geological distinctiveness between these two places, the way they were created and the way they're made and the way the ridges run and all that kind of stuff, that we'll divide them out.
Yeah.
So
do you mind going into that a little bit more? Because I remember we did the episode with Clay Newcomb, and we were asking him, and he was like, "You guys need to talk about orogeny with Dr. Blevins whenever you get to that point." Yeah. And basically, I won't define orogeny, but I'll let you kind of talk about the formation of the Ozarks, and we call it the Ozark Mountains, but it's actually something a little bit different.
Right. And if you're like me, the word itself makes you uncomfortable.
Yeah.
When Clay first said you need to talk about orogeny with Dr. Blevins, you're probably thinking, what
are we?
Is this like a Dr. Ruth sort of thing?
I don't know that we want to.
Yeah, I mean, the Ouachita orogeny, which happened over 300 million years ago, was basically it's the process by which the Ouachita Mountains were folded up. The Ouachitas are actual mountains. Geologically, they're mountains. The Ozarks is just a big plateau that's been eroded over the years. But that was caused by the collision of continents as continents moved. And it's not happening, immediately. This is happening over tens of millions of years, as you can imagine. And because where the Ouachitas are, at one time that was basically almost the southern coast of the North American continent, and it collides with South America, and it just sort of folds those things up. The Ozarks, which is north of the Ouachitas, doesn't get folded up, but it's sort of like and again, I'm a historian. I'm not a geologist.
Sure.
So any geologist listening to this realize how ignorant I am when I'm going to keep this as simple as it is in my head.
Yeah.
But in my mind, I've got, as these continents are colliding, you got these tectonic plates underneath the, surface, that the plates sort of scoot in under what's the Ozarks and just sort of lifts them up. It just kind of tilts them up. And some geographers and geologists even refer to the Ozarks as an uplift. Plateau, uplift, there are a lot of different phrases and words you can use, but it just sort of tilts the Ozarks up. And the southernmost part of the Ozarks is the part that sort of gets tilted the most up. And obviously the podcast listeners can hear my hand movements as I'm doing this for you guys. But
we have the cameras.
Right.
YouTube, if you're lost, go to YouTube.
Yeah, it's just imagine my hand movements. So you get the Boston Mountains at the southern part of again, not
so
technically
it's the most extreme. Is that
it gets the most extreme tilting?
Okay.
Upward, and it's kind of the flare up at the bottom of that, at the very point of that tilt, and so that's where the highest elevations are in the Ozarks. But again, they're not geologically mountainous, which happens by folding or by volcanic activity, that kind of thing. The only part of what we call the Ozarks today, the Ozark Plateau, the only part of it that is technically mountainous is the St. Francis Mountains, which is it's the ancient core of the Ozarks in southeastern Missouri, around Ironton and Pilot Knob and that area. It's a very rural area. The St. Francis Knob and Basin region is sometimes what geographers call that. And that was caused by volcanic activity dating back to almost 1.5 billion years ago. These are ancient mountains that are, just hundreds of millions of years older than the Rockies and the Himalayas, and all that's left of them is those little knobs up there in southeastern Missouri.
Yeah.
And none of them are impressive at all. And nothing really looks like a mountain. It's just a decent hill that you could run up it backwards if you were in training. And but that's the only part of the Ozarks that is technically mountainous. And you've got igneous rock up there that's hundreds and hundreds of millions of years old. A lot of the granite that was mined to pave the streets of St. Louis and make monuments and things like that in St. Louis and build things, not just St. Louis, but other places. A lot of that came out of that, that old igneous volcanic rock area of that part of the Ozarks.
Yeah.
But the rest of what we've got is just a plateau that over more than 300 million years, pretty much, has been severely eroded, and you could probably you could think of it, since we're in the Ozarks and we're pretty plebeian type people. It's a pretty poor place for most people outside of some folks in Northwest Arkansas and in Springfield. I like to think of it as an older professor friend of mine used to say, is the Ozarks is just a land of ditches.
Yeah.
That's kind of what it is. It's just a bump in the earth with a whole bunch of ditches, some of them deeper than others,
So when we say the Ozark Mountains, we really should be saying Ozark valleys or ditches.
Yeah.
That would be more appropriate as we speak on orogeny and how it was all formed.
Yeah. If from a scientific, from a geological standpoint, Ozark valleys, or you could call it ridges, ditches, plateau, uplift. There are a lot of things. Mountains is probably one of the most incorrect things to call the Ozarks. But I'm not gonna fight with anybody, because we're so used to calling them the Ozark Mountains, and it's been around for 200 years.
It's become a part of the cultural Ozarks.
Yeah, it really is. That earliest map that we've got from the 1820s that had Ozark Mountains stretching from basically modern day northeastern Texas to St. Louis. Using the old big expansive definition of the Ozarks, and it was Ozark Mountains on that one too. So I'm not going to get out of shape over somebody calling them mountains, because all I know about geology and geography is something I read in a book. I never even had a geology class or anything.
So real simply, the Ouachitas, there was a coastline there At some point, we're talking.
Yeah,
millions
just
of years
south,
ago.
just kind of like the southern part of Arkansas would have
Okay.
been like the coastline.
And those are technically mountains because of the way the plates folded and pushed up.
Right.
And they did that at about the same time that the plateau
Yeah.
was also being formed.
Well, the Ozarks, kind of the rock base of the Ozarks is much older, especially when you get to that core area when you're talking about over 1 billion years old. So there were uplifts and different things going on before the Ouachita orogeny in the Ozarks. But yeah, for the most part, since that event that creates the Ouachitas and really does a number on uplifting the Ozarks, 300 plus million years. That's kind of what we're working with today is the remnants of that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's definition 1 as we're defining the Ozarks is where we are on a map, the physical.
The physical Ozarks.
What's the second step?
Yeah, the second one is the cultural Ozarks, and that's the much trickier definition because when you're talking about cultural Ozarks, you're talking about humans, you're talking about community, you're talking about what we call social constructs. These are definitions that we create, that we make them so, that didn't exist prior to humans being around here, or even prior to certain kinds of humans being around here. The cultural idea of the Ozarks, only dates back a few generations. And it's this idea that, and basically what it is, it's an idea that the Ozarks is home to a certain kind of people. And some of the people who live in the physical Ozarks identify with that, and some of those people don't identify with that. And a lot of that construct was created by people who didn't live in the Ozarks anyway. A lot of it was created by stereotyping and taking examples of the craziness that some of us did in past years, and the kind of the hillbilliness that was part of the region, and magnifying that above everything else. So if you're looking at one of the things I had intended to do when I did volume 3 of my trilogy a couple years ago is I had every intention of fixing a cultural map of the Ozarks for that book.
You were gonna put it on paper and this is what it is.
This is what this guy says is the Ozarks, and I was gonna have boundaries and everything. And I spent a lot of time. I've been traveling, especially since I got to Missouri State back in 2008. And one of the things I would do is I would go on these road trips around the Ozarks to places I'd never been. And I used to do this all the time in those earlier days. And when I knew I was somewhere sort of on the cultural edge of the Ozarks, a place that Milt Rafferty and the geographers would say is in the physical Ozarks, but maybe it's a little questionable culturally. I would just ask people. I'd go to a library, go to a convenience store, just go somewhere, and I would say, "Am I in the Ozarks?" Just to get an idea of that.
I'm sure you got some funny looks.
Yeah, I did.
What are you talking about?
I did.
Why are you asking me that?
Right, I did. I should have had like a hidden camera to show something. But I remember the best one I ever got. There's this little town up in the northern part of the Ozarks, and not far south of the Missouri River, called Vienna. It's in Marys County, Missouri. Just beautiful rolling hills and cattle farms and all that kind of stuff. Just real Ozarky looking place. I mean, just real Ozarky. And I remember I was coming back from Jefferson City, and I was driving down toward Rolla, and I stopped at this filling station, this convenience store, and I walked in and I bought a soda pop or something like that, and I went up to the counter, and I asked the girl at the counter, I said, "Am I in the Ozarks?" And she didn't even hesitate. She said, "No." And I said, "Well, how would I get to the Ozarks from here?"
She probably thought you were so lost.
Yeah. And she said, and again, there was no hesitation at all. She said, all right, get back on the highway, go down here to the stop sign, take a right, drive 10 miles, you'll be in Iberia, and you're in the Ozarks.
10 miles away.
It's just 10 miles away, and it's a town. There's a specific place. If you get there, you're in the Ozarks. You know, and that's sort of the cultural divide. Now, I've since met plenty of people from Vienna who said, hey, we're in the Ozarks. I don't know where she must have been from Westphalia or something. You know, she's from somewhere else. But for her, you know, she culturally didn't identify with the Ozarks, but she knew, you know, those goobers over in the next town.
10 miles away. Those are Ozarkers.
That's where you're going to find the hillbilly people in Iberia and Miller County. And that's especially up in that kind of northern edge of the Ozarks in the Missouri Valley and the Mississippi Valley. That's where you'll find a lot of places where people don't identify at all with the Ozarks. And mostly it has to do with the old German heritage in those places. And you can go to a lot of those, like a little town. I said Westphalia earlier. That's just a few miles north of Vienna. It's an old German Catholic town, beautiful place, just a picturesque little town. You drive through a few hundred people and these rolling hills and all this, just beautiful place. And a lot of those folks they came from German-speaking places in Europe in the 1830s and 40s and 50s, and they saw themselves as separate from the people who were already there. You know, the people that the people, English speakers who had come across the Mississippi and settled from Tennessee and Kentucky and North Carolina and places like that. And it's amazing how long that identity sticks with them, that kind of separatist identity. Okay, these are the local people. We're something different. We're Germans. Yeah. You know,
even though we live near each other and in the same place.
Yeah, we're in the same place.
We're not Ozarkers.
Right. We're not. And today you'll find that in a lot of places. And I've asked people over, like in the Mississippi Valley, which was also heavily settled by Germans in the same era, the decades before the Civil War. And I've got the same. Well, they didn't say go to Iberia. That's a long ways off. But I remember asking a woman over. We were about 10 miles from the Mississippi River, this rolling farmland that, the geographers say it's the Ozarks. And, it doesn't look like the Boston Mountains, but it's in the Ozarks. And when I asked her, where do I need to go to the Ozarks, she said Branson. And so that was, again, very specific, but immediately when somebody says Branson, they've been influenced by this stereotype and tourism promotion and all that kind of stuff. So ultimately, I abandoned the idea of coming up with a cultural map of the Ozarks, because if there was a way to poll everybody who lived in the physical Ozarks and ask them, "Are you an Ozarker?" You could make a map that way, but that might not be completely accurate either.
Right. You could have some weird spots, and it's not all contiguous. You might have these outliers in different places.
Right. And I've in my own mind, I've got, there are highways that sort of separate the Ozarks from the non-Ozarks, even within the physical Ozarks. But in the end, I realized that it's just it's an ever evolving thing, and just as you lose a bunch of the cultural Ozarks in the northern part of the Ozarks, you gain a bunch in Arkansas, because there are plenty of people who live south of what the geographers say is the Ozarks who identify readily with the Ozarks.
Right.
And you're not going to convince them otherwise either. Because I always thought, well, one of the problems I had with the standard geographer's map was that it did cut off pretty quick when you headed south. And there were places where I always thought, well, that's the Ozarks, but the geography, it's not the physical Ozarks, but culturally, the Ozarks heads way down, close to the Arkansas River,
right? The
other way. You don't have to be, you don't have to cut it off just when you fall out of the Boston Mountains,
right?
There's a lot of Ozarkness south of the physical Ozarks down there, so we kind of make up for it. We lose Germans, we gained more hillbillies
On
down
the south side.
on the southern side of it.
That's interesting that you'd say North Missouri, you're losing culturally a lot of the Ozarks, even though it's very much within the region. And then a big chunk of Arkansas, even if they don't technically hit within the geological Ozarks, are like, no, that's absolutely my identity.
Right.
I've never thought about that. That's true.
Yeah.
Though. I mean, you'll have people in almost Little Rock who are like, absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm an Ozarker.
People in the river towns down there, like Clarksville and Russellville, I think they would identify. And there's even like businesses and companies down there that are like named the Ozark Bank or the Ozark Welder or something like that.
Yeah. There's a college down there, the University of the Ozarks, which is not in the physical Ozarks.
It's interesting.
You know,
called them out.
So is that like it? So if you go north, is that like a kind of they knew the stereotype of the Ozarks as being kind of hillbilly, and they almost looked down on it, and so they were like, "That's not us. We're not a part of that." But then why and on the southern side are those people like, actually, yeah, I do identify with that. Like, I want to be a hillbilly.
Yeah. Well, that's what I think happens along the like the Missouri Valley, is that it just goes way back to a lot of those German settlers of the 19th century were much better educated and were better off financially than the folks that they settled among. And so I think some of it was just kind of a separation based in condescension a little bit.
Yeah.
And then a lot of it, they were also, this was an age of kind of an early age of German nationalism, extreme. And a lot of these people were extreme German nationalists.
Okay.
We're proud of our German heritage and want to hold on to that. And that doesn't mean sort of, assimilating into this kind of rabble-rousing population of English speakers who are already here. So that's going on. But on the bottom end of the Ozarks, down in Arkansas, the south end, I think a lot of it's just the recognition that culturally there's practically no difference. There's a lot of what people are doing out in the Arkansas River Valley, and certainly in the foothills of the River Valley, even on the south side of the Arkansas River. I mean, we sound the same. They're, for the most part, they're from the same historical migration patterns, though you do have quite a few Germans who settle in the Arkansas Valley too. Mm-hmm. I mean, that is true, but not nearly to the extent that you have up in the Missouri Valley. And so I think it's a lot of it is just that, there is that kind of natural commonality where people don't see themselves being that different when they, come out of the, say, Conway County or parts of Faulkner County, and mm-hmm. they go further north into what the geographers say is the Ozarks. I mean, you go down there today and, they're raising cattle and cutting hay and stuff just like we do up there. So it's not terribly different. And for the most part, they're Baptist and Pentecostal and that kind of stuff, just like most folks historically in the Ozarks. So if you take the physical Ozarks and you have one of those like shaded, little shaded things over it, mm-hmm. that's exactly the size of the physical Ozarks, and you just kind of scoot it down a little bit. In some ways, that's kind of that's the cultural Ozarks.
Gotcha.
You just scoot it down about 30 miles.
Yeah. And you get a whole lot more
right, and there
people, right.
And there you are. But even that, there's going to be and then we haven't even mentioned Oklahoma.
Yeah.
You talk about really getting
what do you do with those people
really
over
getting
there?
dicey. I know people from northeastern Oklahoma who very strongly identify with the Ozarks. Mm-hmm. But over there you throw in the extra factor of Native American heritage. Right. So many folks in Cherokee County and Adair and those different Sequoia, those counties over there are of Cherokee descent, or even some other nations that lived in the northeastern part of Oklahoma. If you rank your identities, the Ozark identity, regional identity, is going to be lower on the list for a lot of those folks, because for many of them, the Native American identity is going to be right there at the top, or certainly near the top, above any sort of Ozark identity. But still, I've met people who are, card carrying members of the Cherokee Nation who very much identify with their Ozarks heritage.
Yeah.
So it's just trickier when you get over there, because it doesn't necessarily mean the same thing
right
as it does in Arkansas and Missouri.
Yeah, it is interesting, and we've talked to a few guys on the podcast from over that way in Oklahoma, and even a buddy of ours, he's from Miami, Oklahoma, and he's like, oh, I'm not an Ozarker, but I'm like, you're like right there on the edge if you look at the map, and it's kind of interesting, and I think that goes back to the point of like,
doesn't he have Native American descent?
And he does,
yeah,
actually, yeah,
like he's like quarter or even a half.
Yeah,
so that's a pretty strong part of his identity, his own identity.
But it goes to the point of it's not as straightforward as just drawing a line and saying this is it. It's geology mixed with, well, wherever people kind of say is the Ozarks.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's there's a sociologist named John Shelton Reed, who's retired now from the University of North Carolina, and for years and years he wrote all kinds of really interesting stuff about basically just defining the South. What is the South? Where is the South? When are you outside of the South? When are you in it? And all that kind of stuff. And a lot of it just kind of came back to the South is where the Southerners live. It's where people identify as Southerners. And ultimately, the cultural Ozarks would be where Ozarkers live. But figuring out where that is, that's the tricky part. And we, to a certain degree, we carry that with us to other places around the country, at least for a generation or two. I think of places like Bakersfield and the Pacific Northwest, where so many of my family members went, places like Wenatchee and Yakima and Washington State. And there are other really popular destinations for people from the Ozarks. And for a generation or two, those places became pretty Ozarky, pretty hillbilly, I guess you would say. Though after a while, I'm sure it wears off, and it's not to that extent anymore.
Right.
But we see that now, of course, in Northwest Arkansas, the place is so much more racially and ethnically diverse than it has been since the very first days of white settlement in this part of the world, when white people were still outnumbered by Native Americans here, and you had the French and you had Germans coming in here and all that stuff, and that that's another thing that is really gonna we'll just kind of have to wait and see with people like the Marshallese and people of Hispanic descent and all that. How, at what point do they feel a connection to this region called the Ozarks, if they ever do?
That's true.
When does Ozarkers start to creep up their list of identities? Right. And how far does it go up that list? I don't really know. Or is a really kind of multi-ethnic, multiracial society, is that the end of regional definition and regional identity as we've known it to this point? Right. And it may, it's certainly not going to be the same. It may be a period of metamorphosis into something else. Yeah. I mean, the Ozarks is not what it was 50 or 60 years ago, and certainly 100 years ago. And there's no reason for us to expect that it's going to be 50 years from now and 100 years from now. Right. It's going to be something that we can't imagine now, because it hasn't become yet.
That's something that is cool about regional history, though, is how do other societies and people and influences and stories and histories change even that place's culture and make it more interesting and more beautiful, in some ways more complicated, all of that kind of stuff. Like I look at what the Ozarks, at least from where we are, and what it's becoming, and you have a really interesting mix of some really old history and some really new ways of thinking, and it's sometimes it's like a beautiful painting, sometimes it feels like oil and water a little bit, and it's just like, how's this going to work out? I think it's fascinating.
It is, and we're in such an early stage of that. I mean, we're talking about a process that's been going on now for about 30 years. And I mean, 30 years is not much of anything.
Nothing in history.
I mean, it's not even half of an average, lifetime in modern America. And if you think about, we talked about those Germans and their descendants who settled in the region, less than 200 years ago, and even the sort of cultural resistance that they had. Maybe at one point, much of Northwest Arkansas may look at the Ozarks the same way as that's people we settled among, but that's not us.
Yeah, so that's Branson argument.
Yeah.
Or drive over to Huntsville or drive a little bit further into Alpena from Northwest Arkansas.
Yeah,
it's that separatist idea of like, maybe I feel better than you because I'm not so hillbilly or whatever.
Right. Yeah. Well, yeah. Northwest Arkansas. I mean, that's a new thing for us.
It is.
I mean, we've had ethnic and racial diversity in the past. We've never had sort of the affluence on the level. I mean, the Ozarks is traditionally a poor place.
Right.
And even the better off places are poor compared to the rest of the nation. But now, I mean, we're just plumb affluent in some places. I mean, Benton County, Arkansas is an affluent place. However you want to measure it statistically, it is. And that's something that we're not used to in the Ozarks. And what does that mean for Ozarks identity or maybe for a county seceding from the Ozarks? They may just decide, hey, well, I mean,
we're going to join Oklahoma and Kansas up there in that top corner.
Yeah. Is there someplace else we can connect to? But you've got crystal bridges and things like that in your high South cuisine and all that sort of stuff that, it definitely gives a new flavor to one corner of the Ozarks,
for sure.
But it also runs the risk of for people who come to Northwest Arkansas for work, but who have no connection, no experience out in the rest of the broad Ozarks. It certainly can give them a false idea about the region, because for the most part, the Ozarks is, in terms of geographical space, the Ozarks has traditionally been a land of have-nots instead of a land of haves. And we've got probably the starkest example, the starkest divide now that we've ever had because of, some of the affluence that we've got in certain little pockets of the Ozarks, and the rest of the region is still not a whole lot different than it has been for generations. Yeah, and maybe even heading the other direction, because there's a lack of opportunity in the vast geographical space of the Ozarks that you don't experience in these little pockets of privilege.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I can speak for myself. A lot of the people that I work with on a day-to-day basis are not from here. They've moved from out of state, from a lot of big cities, and they have no connection to the Ozarks. And when I talk about hunting and fishing at work and the stuff that I like to do, they look at me like I've got three eyes, and they're like, people do that? People still around here? There are bears here. You can go deer hunt, like all that. And it's funny to me. And so I try to do a okay job of talking about it and telling people about it, of like, this is what we did, and however many years
we all
ago
came from.
This is where we came from. This is how people survived and how they got meat, and this is what we ate. I took some bear jerky to work, and people were like, yeah, what? you got that?
Yeah.
And they loved it. And I was like,
Yeah.
see, this is cool. But it's definitely changed.